My family and I used to live in Tasmania, Australia. Tasmania is a small island underneath Australia, and when you want to travel from Tasmania to the mainland, you have to go by plane, or if you want to take a car, you have to go by boat so you can take your car. The name of the boat that goes back and forth between Devonport, Tasmania and Melbourne is the Spirit of Tasmania. And a few years back, you could choose whether you wanted to go to Melbourne or to Sydney. And I've made the journey to Melbourne many times, but this time I was traveling to Sydney and then going north a bit further for a week and then coming back home. So I went on the Sydney trip and I discovered something. 22 hours it takes on the boat, and 22 hours is just enough time for people to unwind and sit down with people they don't know and start sharing their stories. And I had the most amazing conversations on that boat. On my way from Tasmania to Sydney, I met a man and his son. As I was sitting in the morning reading my Bible, waiting for the cafeteria to open for breakfast, I was sitting there reading, and you know that feeling you get when someone's staring at you? Well, they were. And I looked over, and there's this man, Robert, I found his name later was, and his son Isaiah. And the man looked at me and he said, "Is that the word, brother?" And I looked down at my Bible and looked back at him and said, yes it is. Oh, it's good to see someone reading God's word in a public place. And I said, "Thank you." And then he said, "Do you mind if I ask what you do for a living?" And I said, "Sure, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist minister." He said, "Oh, okay." Well, the doors opened behind him into the cafeteria, and he said, "Well, Isaiah, we better go in to breakfast. Come along." And so they turned. He said, "Let's let the pastor get back to the word." And so they turned and left and walked through the doors. And it was just a couple seconds later, Isaiah, about 6 years old, comes running back out. "Can you please sit with us? We saved you a seat. You can sit with us." And so I said, "Sure, I can do that." So I closed my Bible up and followed Isaiah in, and we sat down and had this beautiful long conversation with other people coming and going to the table. And we sat there for about an hour. And as we were winding up our meal conversation, we were finally alone. A lady had stood up and left our table to go get some more food or something. And so Robert and Isaiah, it was just them and me. And Robert leans forward and says, "Could I ask you a personal question, Pastor David?" And I said, "Sure you can." He looks around and goes, "Well, could I ask you somewhere private?" And I said, "Sure. Look, I was going to go up to the deck, the second deck up there, the enclosed one, and just sit and read until we get to Sydney. So you can come up anytime today, and I'll be up there." And he said, "Okay, I'll do that." So I went up there, and I'd barely sat down when Robert and Isaiah came walking through the door. And Robert sat down, and he said to Isaiah, "You go play in the playground," which was just right next to us, but was enclosed, so he really felt we were private, and there was no one else around us. And Robert asked me a question that I had no idea what the answer was. And I don't even remember the question because it was such a convoluted question, and I said, "You know, Robert, I'm not really sure what the answer to that question is." And I think that's a valuable thing to know sometimes when people ask you questions. You don't have to try to say an answer. And sometimes in personal discussions, you can actually say, "I'll find out the answer for you and I'll tell you next time we meet." But this was probably the only time I'd meet Robert, so I just said, "Sorry, I don't have any idea." And he said, "Okay, well, I have another question, and this is the real question I wanted to ask you." I said, "Okay, what is it?" He said, "Can you prove to me that the Sabbath is still valid today?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I could do that." And I started to reach for my Bible, and he said, "Wait, look, I've got to come clean with you. I've been to a number of your programs in your churches. I went to a Revelation seminar series in Queensland, where I used to live, and I even went to that Net 98 thing where they pull the message down from the satellite, and I watched Dwight Nelson do all of his talks and everything. So I know everything you Adventists believe, and I know all the texts you use to prove the Sabbath. And what I'm wanting to know is the Sabbath still valid for today? Can you prove it to me?" And I said, "Do you want me to prove it to you without using the texts from the Bible?" And he said, "Well, not the text that you normally use." And I thought, what am I supposed to do? And I just felt this answer just come. And I thought that the Holy Spirit's just given me this answer. And I said, "Robert, you know in Malachi 4:10, where it says, 'Bring your tithes,' and he finished it for me, 'into the storehouse.'" I said, "That's right." And God says that he will richly bless us if we do that, because it's our way of saying, "Yep, I belong to God. I'll return what's already his, my tithe," and he blesses us for that. I said, that's a blessing promise that the Bible has for us, and God has for us. The Sabbath is much the same. It's a blessing waiting to be given to us. God says, "I have created time. I have set a memorial in time away, set it away for you and me to meet. And if you honor the Sabbath, I will bless you for the rest of the time in your week." And he said, okay. And I said, Robert, and I don't know, not normally like this, but I just said, Robert, I want to challenge you. And he said, okay. And I said, I want to challenge you to keep the Sabbath for 6 months and see if God blesses you. And Robert's face just lit up. And he said, my wife and I have been keeping the Sabbath for about a year, and God has been blessing us for the last year. So do you mean that the reason why God has been blessing us is because we've been keeping His Sabbath? And I said, it's a promise. And he said, oh, thank you so much. That's fantastic. And you know, that was the end of our conversation. We talked about other things, I'm sure, but that was the end of that moment. And I've never met Robert again. I don't know if he became a Seventh-day Adventist or where his faith led him after that, but I felt honored that I got to be at that point in his journey. On the way back, a week later, on the Spirit of Tasmania, again going south this time, my bunkmate, there's bunks that you can stay in overnight, and they have little curtains on them, and my bunkmate's name was John, and he was sleeping on the bottom, and I was up the top, and as we got there in the evening, he said, my name is John, and I said, I'm Dave. And the next morning, as we got up, he said, have breakfast with me, David. And I said, I will. So we sat and had breakfast, and we talked for 4 hours. And he told me story after story after story, and I told him stories from my life, and we basically learned everything, the history of each other, of our whole lives. And John was retired and had decided in his retirement to buy a little news agency in Tasmania and move down there from New South Wales, just above Sydney, where he lived. And one of the things that John had done for all these years before he retired, the main thing he did was he was a collector. He would buy old things that other people had either thrown away or didn't value, and he would do them up again and then sell them. And occasionally he would find things that were of great value that people didn't understand how valuable they were. And he said to me, I asked him, what's the most valuable thing you ever came across? And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, I bought a vase off a shelf for $2. And I knew what it was when I was holding it. And I had them wrap it in nice paper. How much do you want for this? Oh, $2. And so he said, I took it home and I cleaned it up and made it really beautiful. And I sold it about a month later for $17,000. And I said, wow. I said, so that's the most money you've ever made on anything. And he said, well, percentage-wise, $2 to $17,000. But he said, you'll actually like this one. The one that I made the most money on was a church. He said, in the town where I grew up, in Louis, New South Wales, there was 2 churches on the opposite sides of the street. One was the Protestant church, one was the Catholic church. And I was a Protestant boy, and I was not allowed to go in the Catholic church, even when my good friend was married. I could go to the reception afterwards, but not inside the church. And he said there was just this real battle between the 2 groups of people in the churches. And he said as Louis people moved out of Louis and moved to the city, he said the Catholic church closed down, and they decommissioned it and finally put it on the market. And he said, I just couldn't imagine our little town without the 2 churches. So I went there to get the bidding started on this church, because I knew if somebody doesn't buy the whole thing, they're going to cut it into pieces. They're going to sell the pews, they'll sell the stained glass windows, they'll sell anything of value, and then knock the building down and rebuild something else. And he said, and I just didn't want to see that happen. So I started the bidding when they said $35,000. We'll start the bidding at $35,000. And so he raised his card and waited when they said, okay, $37,500. 35,000 going once, going twice, sold. And he bought the Catholic church for $35,000. And so he started using it as a place to store his collectibles. And for 10 years, he kept the church. Then he retired, wanted to move to Tasmania. And his kids said, Dad, you're not going to leave all that stuff up there in that church and not protect it. We need you to sell it all and sell the church. So he did. He put it on the market. And he sold the church 10 years later for $345,000. So just to him, it was just a good story about a church, but I thought, it tells a great story about how often we undervalue what we have in our church. And it's not so much the bricks and mortar and the windows, but it's the people. And after we'd been talking for quite some time, John said, Dave, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure. And he said, does it make you angry that I'm not going to become a Christian? And I was blown away. I said, why would it make me angry? He said, well, it's your job to make me a Christian. You're a Christian pastor. Don't you feel like you've failed? I mean, you've talked to me for all these hours and I'm not going to become a Christian. And I had a real awakening experience of how they see us as leaders. And I said, John, I think that the Christian life, all life, is a journey. And we're like stones in the river crossing that journey. And I want to be, rather than a stumbling block, I want to be a stepping stone in your journey to Jesus.